Have you guys ever found yourself in the middle of a home reorganization project and you've discovered that if you only had a shelf to fit a very specific area of your home, that shelf would make a huge difference in reducing clutter and keeping things a lot more organized? Have you ever found yourself in that situation? If you have, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button right now. Because that's exactly where I am at this moment. I'm working on reorganizing an area of our home, and I really could use a shelf. So if you guessed that in this episode of HomeVet Workshop, we're gonna build a shelf, you guessed correct. We're gonna build this small shelf right here that's gonna work perfectly for exactly what I need, but don't worry, if your space requirements are a little bit different, you can just change the dimensions to suit the size that you need. The construction techniques are gonna be exactly the same. Let's build this thing. Stick around. Now for materials to build the shelf, you can use about whatever you have available. Hardwood, softwood, plywood, whatever works for you. But for me, these pieces of elm behind me may be a dead giveaway as to what I'm going to use for this shelf. Unfortunately, most of the really good stuff has been already used up. The stuff that I have left has some cracks and defects and stuff in there. There's a pretty good chance we're gonna have to splice some pieces together. Maybe we're gonna have to do some fills with epoxy. I'm not quite sure yet because this stuff is still rough. I gotta get it cut down to size. First off, we need to get a straight line ripped on one side. Now for other projects, I've taken larger quantities of this to a local wood shop to have it straight line ripped. But for these, there's only 3 or 4 pieces. I think we can get by just fine using a straight edge and a circular saw. I'm gonna use a nice long straight edge to mark out a line along one edge of these boards. Then I'll use my circular saw to cut on that line, which will give me one fairly straight edge. Now we'll clean them up and flatten the faces by running it through my planer. This elm's pretty hard, so I gotta take small bites. And I'll square up one edge on the jointer. So now, as I mentioned, we're going to need to address some knots, some cracks, some defects in these boards. To do that, just going to use some 2-part epoxy. We're going to pour it in here. I've left these boards a little bit thicker than what I'm going to need at the very end. That way, once we get the epoxy in here, we have some room to sand them down to their final thickness. I'm going to add a little bit of pigment to the epoxy before we pour it on. The main reason that I have to do this is because, well, I've already picked through all the good material, and these are the pieces that are left. Not really a big deal, still good material. We just got to fix these couple spots. There's not really a science to this step. I'm just making sure to add some epoxy to every single defect that I can see. Now I'm going to pass a heat gun over the epoxy. This helps draw the air bubbles out of the epoxy, making sure it's nice and solid. You could also do this with a torch, but for some reason mine wouldn't light and I threw it in the trash. And now a quick pass through the drum sander will level out all the epoxy and make it nice and smooth again. You could also do the same thing by running it back through the planer as well. With all of these cracks stabilized, I think we can now finally move on to cutting them down to length, ripping them to width over at the table saw. So now here we have all of our pieces that are going to make up this little shelf. We have 2 pieces that are going to make up the sides. We still have some sort of trimming and stuff to do on it, but they're cut to size, as well as the 2 pieces that are going to make up the shelves. Now what we need to do is some quick layout work on the side pieces so that we can cut the dados to accept the shelves. All I really need to do is figure out which side I want to be the inside of the shelf. I guess it really doesn't matter since these are patched up with epoxy anyways. There's not really a perfect clean face, so we'll just choose this one, and go with it. The layout for this shelf is going to be really simple. The first shelf is going to be 1.5 inches from the bottom, and then the second shelf will be 13 inches above the first shelf. That's really all we need to do. And there is where we need to cut the dados for the shelves. I'll raise my saw blade about half the thickness of these boards. So I'll show you really quick how I'm going to set this up, then we're going to cut this as a test piece to make sure we've got it right before actually cutting the actual piece. It's really important to do a test cut first, especially if you don't have any other material, because I don't want to screw this up. My first shelf is going to be 1.5 inches off the bottom. I've got a mark here at 1.5 inches. I'm just going to line that up with my blade where I want to make the cut. Then I've got a stop block and a spacer that I've shimmed with a piece of tape to be as close as I can get to the actual stock thickness that I'm going to use. I'm going to hold my pieces in place, slide the stop block over, then we'll clamp this down. So now I'll be able to make my first cut with the spacer block, which is going to make it 1.5 inches from the bottom. I can remove the spacer, slide the piece down, make the second cut, and then make a bunch of small cuts to remove the material from the center, which should give me a nice clean dado. I do want to stress the importance of doing a test cut. Grab you a piece of scrap and just make sure that your setup is going to work. You don't want to start cutting into your actual material only to find out you had something wrong and now your dados are way too big. Of course, if it's too small, you can always go bigger, but if you make the first cut and it's in the wrong spot or it ends up being way too wide, really hard to fix, a lot easier. Make a test cut first. After a couple test cuts, I got a really good fit. I think it's going to work out really well once we apply some glue. I did have to adjust my spacer piece with a couple of pieces of masking tape just to get the fit just right. I think we are now ready to move on to cut the actual dados. This process is not hard at all. Most of the time you're going to spend is in the setup, getting everything just right, but it's definitely worth doing that ahead of time. That way this process goes nice and quick and simple. And while the stop block's already set, I'm going to cut the opposite side as well. Then I'll change the setup and cut the second dado. That worked out really well. Just a tiny bit of cleanup we're going to have to do in there because I didn't swap out my table saw blade for one with a square tooth profile. That would have eliminated all of the cleanup, but there's so little, it's not going to take long at all. But right now, what I need to do is cut a little bit of a profile on the sides of these. To do that, we're going to use the bandsaw, some double-sided tape, stick these things together, mark out where we want to cut. This step is really optional. If you want just a really basic shelf, you wouldn't need to do this, but I kind of want to add a little something to it, so we're going to make a couple cuts. In order to cut these both at the same time, I'm going to stick them together with double-sided tape. Did you guys notice that? I almost made a big mistake. Look how I stuck these together. I stuck the opposite sides together. So if I made the cuts here, one could have potentially been on the back. Could have been bad. That's better.
Now we'll just do a little bit of quick layout work to mark out where I want to make these cuts. The old roll of tape trick always works well for a rounded corner. I'll use a flexible steel ruler to get a nice curve down the center. And now with the bandsaw, we'll just quickly cut that material away.
You guys ever make a cut and then realize you don't really like the design? The shelf's gonna be right about here. There's just too much material there. I kind of wanted to have some sides on the upper shelf, but it just looks strange to me. I'm gonna modify that. We're just gonna lop some of this off, put a simple rounded corner on the front, and call it good. It's okay to change your designs mid-project. They're your designs. Make the changes that you want to see and move on.
And now I can pop the two pieces apart, and I'll use a sharp chisel to clean up the dados. There's not much to remove, so this part is really easy. And now we can begin the step that you've all been waiting for. Yes, it's time to sand. I wanted to get the majority of the sanding done now while the pieces are separate, and I can easily get to all sides. Once we glue it together, it's not quite as easy to get to everything, so it's just going to be faster if I do it now. And if we can save time sanding, I'm all about it. Does this happen to you guys?
Really? Let's glue this. A lot of people use an acid brush or a glue brush to get in there. This is my glue brush. And that's not because I have any problem with glue brushes, I just always forget to get something. I always have these. I've got to use these giant long pipe clamps because this thing is just a little bit longer than my widest bar clamps. That's not really a big deal. It's just going to be a little awkward once we get it clamped together. I got to make sure I don't smash into those sides. All right. Now we'll just quickly wipe up any squeeze out. You want to do it now because it's going to be really hard to clean out some of these joints a little bit later. It can be done, but it's a lot easier just to wipe it out now while the glue is wet. You don't have to worry about it. All right, we'll just give it a little bit of time to dry.
Now, one thing I should have done when I clamped this together, I should have used a piece of wood between the sides of the shelf and the clamp. Since I didn't do that, I've got a couple of marks in the side from the clamp. I'm just going to sand those out real quick.
Well, now all that's left to do is to begin applying the finish. Now, since this little shelf is so small, I am not at all concerned about the strength in these glue joints. The glue is going to be perfectly strong. I have no doubts that it is going to work as intended. But if you are building something bigger, or maybe you are planning to store something heavier and you wanted to reinforce these joints, there's no reason you can't do that. You could use dowels, screws, whatever method is your favorite. Go ahead and reinforce the glue joints, but I'm not going to do it to this. We're just going to put some finish on there. And can you guess what kind of finish we're going to use? And if you guessed homebrew finish, you guessed correct. There is a link in the video description of how I make this simple finish consisting of a mixture of mineral spirits, boiled linseed oil, and polyurethane. Check it out if you want to make some of your own. We're just going to wipe this stuff on. Shake well before using.
Now, one of the reasons that I've been using this finish quite a bit is I really like the way it looks on elm. I've used it on several elm projects recently, and it just gives it a really nice color. Something about the oil in the elm, I'm not really sure, but I really like the kind of chocolatey brown color that I get from the elm, especially with this finish.
And after the finish is dry, guys, our shelf is ready to be put to work. I really like how this thing turned out. I really like the fact that I could save what some might consider kind of junk wood by filling these cracks with epoxy and stuff. I was able to save it, keep using those materials. I didn't have to toss them, and it kind of gives it a cool look. I know this thing is going to work out great for the application that I need it, and maybe if you don't need a shelf quite like this, I hope that maybe this video gives you some ideas of how really easy it is to make a shelf. You could change the dimensions, change the size, change whatever you need to change to make something like this suit whatever your need might be. You could change this up, make it into a bookshelf, maybe add another shelf in here, change the height a little bit. You can mix and match and really make any sort of shelf that you might need. Cut some dados on the side, glue your thing together, reinforce the joints if you want to, if you feel the need to, but really super simple to make a shelf for whatever the application is. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this project. I hope maybe it gives you some sort of ideas to how you can make this your own. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time. Cut. That's a wrap.
Once in a while I forget to stop recording and you guys get to go for a ride. Don't mind the garbage picker.
Oh, I never have a rag either. Okay. Paper bags work.
Never mind the fact that there's a rag right on the table behind me. Hey look, our local community barn cats decided to come by and play with the string they found.
Oh yeah.